We're beginning Chapter 7, an interview with Dr.Robert Strecker of Emerging Viruses, AIDS, and Ebola. Nature, accident, or intentional? The next morning, I tried contacting Strecker again. First, I dialed what I thought was his published telephone number. Again, it rang continuously unanswered. Then I called the number directory assistants had given me for Dr. William Campbell Douglas, a physician from Clayton, Georgia, who had published an article entitled "Who Murdered Africa," which supported Strecker's theory. As in past attempts, a machine instructed me to leave a message. Is anyone there? This is about the sixth time I've called. I've been trying to reach you for months. I'm trying to reach Dr. William Douglas. I need to get in touch with Dr. Robert Strecker. My name is Leonard Horowitz, and this is in an emergency. If anyone can answer, would you please return my call? I left my 800 number and hung up. 2 days later, I received a call from Mr. William Douglas. I was delighted. He immediately informed me that he was not the person I sought. I've been getting a couple of calls a month for Dr. Strecker, so I finally decided to get his number. If you like, I can give it to you. Please, I would really appreciate it. Finally, I thought as I quickly dialed the magic numbers, feeling the end of my frustration might be near. Hello, this is Dr. Strecker's office, a woman's kindly voice answered. Following a lengthy introduction, the woman informed me that Dr. Strecker was indeed alive, well, and practicing internal medicine in Needles, California. He was busy seeing patients, I was told, but I was assured he would return my call that evening. All right, I affirmed as I hung up the phone, then I quickly relayed the good news to Jackie. The information on Strecker's whereabouts immediately helped to ease her concerns. On the line, that night, Robert Strecker returned my call with news about his ongoing crusade to bring the truth to light. We spoke at length about our independent investigations, immediately developing the warm rapport that two black sheep isolated from the establishment's scientific flock might. Pondering safety, I asked, has anyone from the government ever bothered you over all these years? Not really, he replied. Since the suspicious deaths of my brother and Representative Huff, I've just gone about my business. There was one incident, though, that occurred shortly after I sent reports of my findings to all the health and intelligence agencies. What happened? Well, first, the CIA warned all agencies that I was a communist and told them not to take anything I said seriously. My brother Ted obtained a copy of the release they sent out through the Freedom of Information Act. Their counterintelligence efforts apparently worked. Do you still have a copy of the release? I wish I did, Strecker replied. It disappeared along with a lot of other records Ted and I had collected. Shortly after Ted's death, my office was burglarized. Interesting, I said. Who do you think did it? I believe it was the CIA, but I obviously can't prove it. Following an illuminating conversation, Robert, as he preferred to be called, and I agreed to mail each other the copies of our previous publications. He would send me a copy of the Strecker memorandum, which I still had not viewed, and I would send him Deadly Innocent, which he had not heard about. Then we also agreed to exchange interviews. I set up a time to be a guest on He Said, She Said, a radio program Strecker co-hosted with Betsy Pryor on KGER-AM, Los Angeles, and he agreed to be interviewed for this book. The Strecker interview. Several weeks went by before we could coordinate our schedules for my telephone interview with Strecker. By this time, I had watched the Strecker memorandum and considered, as Acer had, Strecker's position that AIDS had been predicted, requested, created, and deployed. Strecker, I now knew, was a stocky, earnest-looking man in his late 40s or early 50s. His dark blonde hair glistened as he spoke. His wire-rimmed glasses and slightly graying temples portrayed a more mature, intelligent demeanor than what his boyish face disguised. I gotta read that over. His wire-rimmed glasses and slightly graying temples portrayed a more mature, intelligent demeanor than what his boyish face disguised. Okay, that makes sense to me. He spoke quickly and easily, accompanied by an unmistakable Midwestern drawl. He appeared to me to be a once all-American football hero type whose athleticism and idealism was quickly dashed by the nature of medical education and academic politics. I began the interview by reading from a list of questions I had prepared for Robert to answer. Len. Robert, first off, what convinced you that the AIDS virus was synthetically manufactured? Robert, what convinced us, the Strecker group, was the fact that this new agent had suddenly appeared out of nowhere, that the virus had characteristics of animal viruses more so than human viruses, and that the genetic structure of the AIDS virus actually looked like viruses that appeared in animals that would not normally adapt themselves to humans. In humans. That could have occurred spontaneously, but not by the process that scientists have normally talked about. For instance, not by the virus running in primates, the highest order of mammals including man, monkeys, and lemurs, because if you look at the genetic structure of the AIDS virus, what you find is that the codon choice, the specific sequence of 3-purine and pyrimidine bases in vials. I got off groove. Because if you look at the genetic structure of the AIDS virus, what you find is that the codon choices, the specific sequence of the 3-purine and pyrimidine bases in viral RNA, that codes for the production of a specific amino acid by the infected cell, including the AIDS virus, are not existent in primate genes. Therefore, to assume that they simply mutated in order to adapt themselves into primates in the case of AIDS is vanishingly small, although still possible. What happened is that the virus either mutated in cattle and sheep and then was artificially adapted to humans by growing in human tissue cultures, which virologists do and in which they are easily manipulated in the manner. Or the virus was actually constructed in a laboratory by gene manipulation, which was available to scientists in the early 70s, although many of the techniques were not talked about until the mid-70s, because the biowarfare laboratories throughout the world have always been about 5 to 10 years ahead of other laboratories working on all kinds of projects. In addition, a clearer reason is if you look at the appearance of the human retroviruses, the fact is that there were a host of these things that appeared all at the same time. So you have to explain not only the appearance of HIV-1, but also HIV-2, HTLV, human T lymphocyte virus 1, human T lymphocyte virus 2, human HTLV4, HTLV5, and HTLV6 ad nauseum. And so, to say that these things all spontaneously mutated at the same time in nature and in the same direction to infecting human beings spontaneously and spread disease in worldwide epidemic proportions, in my opinion, is absurd compared to the known fact that scientists were working with exact progenitors of these viruses in their laboratories, which we can document. The green monkey theory. Len, but what about the green monkey theory? The theory that a green monkey bit an African or someone had sex with an ape. Robert, that's just nonsense. Green monkeys are about the size of chickens, so the idea of a human having sex with a female monkey the size of a chicken is, of course, absurd. In addition, the theory that a transmission occurred through biting, of course, is always said to be close to impossible. If you look at the CDC and everybody else, they say that biting is not an easy way to spread these diseases except in the case of the purported green monkey, which is suddenly the way it was spread. We don't believe that viruses came from primates or from green monkeys. In addition, if you look at the whole theory that was published in Rolling Stone, which accuses Wistar Institute of spreading AIDS to Africa in the polio vaccines in the early 1960s, Wistar, of course, says that they have now reviewed all their stocks without finding any incriminating evidence for the allegations. Wistar Institute is one of the world's biological leaders in retrovirus and cancer causation, cancer research, and is located in Philadelphia. And these viruses were originally known by their Philadelphia names. They were called NBC for New Bolton Center, which is also in Philadelphia. And if you look up the original AIDS virus, in our opinion, that goes back to cattle viruses that were called NBC New Bolton Center, I through and about 1 through about 14 or 15. And we identified human T lymphocyte virus 1 and HTLV2 and HTLV3 in those first cultures that were adapted to human beings by growing them in human tissue culture. For many years, actually, you could simply call up New Bolton and say, "Give me some NBC13, and they would send it to you. And then when AIDS appeared around 1978 or so, all of a sudden NBC line For many years, actually, you could simply call up New Bolton Center, say, "Give me some NBC13, and they would send it to you. And then when AIDS appeared around 1978 or so, all of a sudden, the NBC line all disappeared. You could no longer order them." Len, how interesting. The cow theory. Yeah, it is interesting. And so we tracked NBC, I think it's NBC13, back to Louisiana State Agricultural Farm, LSAF. Cow BFC 44, and what happens was, you see, they were looking a lot at HTLV1, which is like bovine leukemia virus, BLV, and this cow at the LSAF, Louisiana State Agricultural Farm, and this cow at the Louisiana State Agricultural Farm, they got thought? What? And this cow at the LSAF they thought, a BLV infection. Okay. She got huge lymph nodes in the neck, just like HTLV and BLV in cattle. And then she apparently conquered it because the lymph nodes went down. She got better after a mononucleosis-like disease, and she made lots and lots of antibodies against this virus. Then about 5 or 6 years later, she started losing weight rapidly, developing diarrhea, and died with pneumonia. And they autopsied her, of course. She had no immune system left. And as far as we can tell, that was the original bovine visnavirus isolate. Len, what year was that? Robert, 1969, and the virus was capable of wiping out T cells selectively. It produced syncytium. It produced syncytium, a mass of cell fluids containing many cell nuclei formed by the joining of originally separate cells as a result of infection or disease in tissue culture, and it does everything that AIDS does. Where was I? Damn. I really lost my place. Okay, here we go. Len, now who was studying that? Robert, that was isolated from the Louisiana State Agricultural Farm. I'm just trying to remember these acronyms myself. Robert, that was isolated from the Louisiana State Agricultural Farm outside of New Orleans. Len, Robert Gallo wasn't the only one studying that virus. Robert, no, everybody was. These cultures were widely distributed. If you go back and look at the veterinary literature, they were looking at all the BLV, bovine leukemia virus lines, bovine syncytium viruses, and bovine visnaviruses, and all these things were being studied. Well, at this point, they were still essentially non-invasive because they were restricted to animals. But then what happened was in the late 1960s and early 1970s, they started growing these in human tissue. Early researchers, Len, now when you say they, can you be more specific in terms of labs that you are familiar with that what they were doing? Man, I messed that one up. Len, now when you say they, can you be more specific in terms of the labs that you're familiar with that were doing this work? Robert, yeah. Well, virtually every lab in the world that was doing sophisticated lymphocyte studies, but particularly Gallo and Company at the NIH. Actually, there were only a few guys, Gallo, Montagnier, a couple of guys that are dead, Baltimore, Tayman, and a few others, and a few veterinarians. Domschkowski was interesting because he was the first one to show you could basically adapt retroviruses to different mammalian species by growing them in the tissue cultures that you wanted them to go to. Now he's down in Texas. Miller in 1969 took bovine leukemia virus and injected it into chimpanzees, and the chimpanzees formed antibodies against the virus. So they concluded that these chimpanzees were immune, and so that was the decision for telling everybody that bovine viruses in human beings posed no threat, which is relatively true. There is a species barrier. Since the 1950s and even the 1940s, Bernie Barbo and all these guys from Europe said these bovine viruses posed a threat to humans, so they began a whole program of mass extermination of cattle in Europe that carried bovine lymphocyte leukemia virus and other viruses. In this country, half of our herds are infected with BLV, BFC, or BVV, And the only thing that has prevented, in my opinion, everyone from dying of T-cell leukemia is the fact that pasteurization of the milk kills viruses. Now, if you look at the distribution of T-cell leukemia, Now, if you look at the distribution of T-cell leukemia across the upper United States, from like Minnesota to Wisconsin, there's a huge incidence of T-cell leukemia in dairy farmers. And if you actually look at some of the studies done in France, they found that guys working in meatpacking plants had a greater incidence of T-cell leukemia too. So there's all this evidence that T-cell leukemia is related to BLV, which is certainly So there's all this evidence that T-cell leukemia is related to bovine leukemia virus, which it certainly is. And for sure, if you culture the virus in human tissue and adapt it, what you get is an HTLV1-like virus that thrives in humans. If you look at BVV, bovine Visna virus, it's very closely related to HIV, but it's still not there. It's not the same AIDS because what you have is bovine Visna virus, a virus growing in cattle. And that's not adapted to humans yet. To adapt it to humans, you've got to grow it in human tissue, and they were doing it in those early 1970s. And what they discovered was that it was a selective T-cell destroyer, just as the AIDS virus is. French-American Bull. Robert, do you know what the true conflict was that occurred between Gallo and Montagnier? Len, that one that I am aware of was that Montagnier actually gave him what he thought was the virus, and Gallo supposedly cloned it. Robert, that was all bull, because they both had the viruses growing in their labs in the early 1970s. The real problem was, and what happens is, suppose you take a culture of lymphocytes. You take T-cell lymphocytes and you dump in human T lymphocyte virus 1 or 2. What happens to the T lymphocyte culture? Then, Len, it gets infected and it proliferates. Robert, that's exactly what happens. The tissue grows and grows and grows in human beings. That's what results in leukemia. You have to take the cells out. They get so packed that the tissue culture dies. Now what happens when you dump bovine Visna virus or AIDS virus into the same tissue cultures? Len, the cells don't grow. Robert, exactly. I won't understand this. I gotta read that again. Now what happens when you dump the bovine Visna or AIDS virus into the same tissue cultures? The cells don't grow. Exactly. They're lysed. They die. So when you come back in a day or two and look, there's nothing left except debris. And so Gallo couldn't figure out how to make enough virus for the antibody tests. They needed virus in quantities to get everything going, and they couldn't get them to reproduce long enough to get large quantities of virus. I felt the urge to interrupt Strecker at this point since I had questioned this same allegation before when Randy Schultz advanced it in the band. Instead, I remained silent, heeding my father's recommendation that I could learn more from listening than speaking. Robert, so that's the real argument. And what Montagnier figured out was if you dump in Epstein-Barr virus onto the T lymphocytes, you immortalize them. They will just sit there and make virus for you, which is why you have an Epstein-Barr virus infection on top of an AIDS virus infection. You're in sorry shape. The immortalized Epstein-Barr virus-infected T cells will just churn out AIDS viruses day after day. And so that was the real thing that Montagnier discovered. Len. And that's not published anywhere? Robert. Oh, sure, it's published. But it's the true argument versus the suspicions argument that you stole my virus. That's all a lot of bull because they both had the virus, and they both knew what they were doing from day one, in my opinion. If that was true, I considered then Gallo would have also known about the Epstein-Barr virus effects, which I recalled he also published, so I questioned Strecker. Now, when I look back at the research literature, at least in the Index Medicus, Montagnier did not have too many publications in the field. In the early 1970s, whereas Gallo had been churning out publications, Robert, except that Montagnier had worked with Gallo. Len, they did? Robert, yes, they were in the same building or on the same hallway. Len, at the National Cancer Institute? Robert, yes. Montagnier was over here, around 1965 or so. He and Gallo were working together. They're all connected. Len, interesting. I had not considered the possibility that Gallo and Montagnier had known about each other's work prior to 1978, as Schultz documented. Robert, and then when Donald Francis and what's-his-name, when they published that cat house experiment and question, is it possible that there's a human retrovirus similar to this one? Of course there was. Gallo had already isolated HTLV-3, and his office was only 25 feet away. I sat up on the edge of my seat, taken by the allegation. The band presented Francis as somewhat of a hero during his alleged conflict with Gallo and other NCI administrators over withholding support for AIDS research. I suspected he knew about Gallo's early research, and Strecker was now alleging the same. Len, do you mean Don Francis from the CDC? Francis was originally at the NCI before he went to the CDC? Robert, yes. He was working there right next to Gallo, and that's when they did their famous cat house experiments showing that the cats were transferring the viruses back and forth amongst themselves, and they wrote this article that said it is possible. I mean, they knew, or else they didn't talk for the whole time. They knew that there was a similar virus out there growing in human beings. Gallo had already isolated it, and their labs were 25 feet apart. Len, now what I seem to have dug up in the WHO Chronicle is that the first American laboratory to be sent any of the viral strains from which they began was the NCI, the National Cancer Institute, Fort Detrick. Robert, yes. Yeah, well, I think that's a lie. I mean, I think the viruses were going in the basement of the National Cancer Institute all along. Do you know about the meeting between Gallo, Montagnier, and Salk? Len, no. Robert, oh my God. Anyway, a year or two ago, and this is documented in Science or somewhere, Gallo, Montagnier, and Salk met in San Diego to write up the history, the official history of their discoveries. Len, Salk, the poliovirus Salk? Robert, yeah. They met down there and made up a story, and I personally believe that virtually everything they wrote was bull. We, referring again to his brother and other colleagues in the Strecker group, understood that they used to meet like 2 or 3 times a week and decide what to tell next, how to package it, how to discuss it. In other words, they already knew everything because they'd been working on it since the early 1970s. They basically knew they had the same stuff, retroviruses and reagents, because if you look at what happened, their discoveries were too quick. Okay, this is Len. Okay, let me explain this now. Why did Gallo in 1980 become so frustrated that he couldn't keep the T lymphocyte cells alive, so allegedly he quit? Robert: What? Len: According to Schultz, Gallo dropped out of the AIDS race for about 2 years. Robert: I don't believe that either. I don't know what he's doing in that time frame, but he was still working on AIDS, there's no doubt about that. Len: According to Schultz, Gallo had only 10% of his lab going on the AIDS problem. He said that Gallo stonewalled researchers throughout the world by not providing the antibodies, not providing the cell lines that were required to identify and cultivate the virus. Robert: Yeah, why would they want to give things away when they knew that was going on already? And it was a matter of Gallo and Montagnier deciding who was going to tell what when. Do you know the story about the patient? Len: Gallo ripped Montagnier off. Robert: Yeah, that's what brought the split. You see, we, the United States, tried to take all the money. Len: Well, that's what they've done. Robert: Yes. So that's what got the French so angry, and what was Montagnier going to do? Come out and say, well, we lied. We've been doing this work all along. We're all crooks. So that's my opinion, what happened. Anybody with any scientific credibility knew that Gallo stole the virus, if that's what they were talking about, because they HTLV3 and LAV were identical. But I think that the big war was really over the money. Len: Oh, sure. Robert: Yeah, anybody with any sense knew. I mean, retrovirologists laugh about it because they knew that Gallo stole it. It was only the press that was blind. Len: But how do you reconcile the first comment that they all had these things, and then later Gallo cloned it, Montagnier's LAV? Robert: They had them, and you can grow the virus in perpetuity if you keep constantly changing their cell line as it kills it. That doesn't mean you can grow it in any quantity. In other words, every lab in the world, and these were all over the world, they weren't just here in France, they were in Germany and Russia and everywhere. And a lot of people had the human cell lines, and they had the cattle cell lines in the early 1970s. And we know they had, in 1976, bovine visnovirus growing in brain tissue in Brussels because we had papers on that. One paper said that the AIDS-like virus would infect human brain tissue, and the guy even wrote, it is possible that this is a cause of slow virus disease of man. So I mean, they were everywhere. The conspiracy of cells. Robert: Plus they were growing in cattle naturally, and we were using fetal calf serum as growth medium for every cell culture in the world. The theory was that since these were extracted from fetuses, they were sterile, but in fact they weren't. Because the AIDS virus and BLV1 and 2 were being transferred in the gene lines, and so they were potentially transferring these viruses into every tissue culture throughout the world. So it gets very mixed up. You've got to read a book called Conspiracy of Cells by Michael Gold. This is a story about Walter Nelson Reese, who worked in the highest containment laboratory in the NIH, the BSL-4 lab. That's where they keep their tissue cultures. They had like 300 to 400 of them. And in 1981, Walter Nelson Reese published a paper in Science saying that over a third of them were Henrietta lack of cell containment cell lines. Henrietta Lack was a black lady who worked at Hopkins in the late 1950s. She died around 1965 or so while she was still working there from a tumor of the uterus that literally ate her alive. And that tissue was the first human tissue that was grown in perpetuity in tissue cultures. Because up till then, they would only grow one or two divisions and then die. And her tissue called HeLa, that's where HeLa comes from, Henrietta Lack, was the first cancer cells that would grow in tissue cultures. Now those cell lines were sent all over the world, and what happened was that scientists were contaminating their tissue culture cells with HeLa accidentally, and in the early 1970s, I think, 72 under Nixon, the Russians sent us 6 cell lines that they thought contained human cancer-causing viruses, and those were sent to Walter Nelson Reese, who was the keeper of the cell lines in the United States. He was in San Francisco, and it was his job to keep the cell lines straight and not contaminate them. That was during the Great War on Cancer. That's where all this stuff came from. The NIH was funded with 72. The NIH was funded in 72 with billions of dollars to find the cancer virus. Nixon was trying to steal the show from Teddy Kennedy by coming up with a virus and vaccine against cancer. They said, let's find a virus. That's where the big cancer virus hypothesis came from. Now, when we got these 6 cell lines from the Russians, Reese started looking at them and discovered that they were all female. Then he discovered that they were all black. And so he questioned, how many black females are there in Moscow who have cancer? And, of course, what he discovered was that these were all Henrietta Lack cell contaminants that contained monkey viruses. And so all of that stuff the Russians sent us was in fact a fraud. But it was very embarrassing. But it was a very embarrassing thing because they thought they had got there first. And what we proved was that they were awful scientists. So then what Walter Nelson Reese did is that he started looking at all the cell lines of the United States and closely. And then he discovered that the NIH at the NIH, over a third of them were HeLa contaminated. What happened was that when they would open their tissue culture lids, they would aerosolize small particles into the air. They would float around and drop into another cell line. And HeLa's so aggressive that it will literally take over, and so it just takes one cell to drop into another cell line and it takes over and it amalgamates, and those were called HeLa contaminated. And so what the NIH did to him, Dr. Reese, was of course defunded him and put him out of business because he proved they were all a bunch of idiots. Len: oh, I see. Robert: so then my problem was you had a whole bunch of HeLa contaminated cell lines floating around and being sent out as clean cell lines that weren't. They were actually human cancer malignant cell lines, and some of them contained viruses that were from other species. And so it represented a big problem. Plus they were throwing in fetal calf serum, which was contaminated with these bovine viruses. So you had a mixture for a natural disaster. I mean, the thing is, like they said in 72 conferences, it was a wonder that we don't have worse disasters. You just wonder why we haven't been annihilated by these idiots. If, for instance, you look at the tissue cell culture that was used to determine X-ray tolerance of human tissue, It turns out it's a HELA contaminated cell line, which means the most radiation-resistant cell line in the world is used as the standard to determine how much radiation a human should be exposed to. Len, unreal. Robert, well, that's all documented in Conspiracy of Cells by Walter Nelson Reese, and it now runs an art gallery. They put him out of business. The patient zero theory. Len, all right, let's get back to the situation with AIDS. What about the patient zero theory? Robert, that's nonsense. First off, this guy lived in Canada and flew primarily in Canadian cities. Yet you must propose that he only had sex in American cities because the disaster broke out in specific American cities where he allegedly had sex. In addition, it doesn't make any sense if you look at the same time frame. AIDS broke out in 78 in Manhattan and then in 80 in San Francisco. It didn't break out in Montreal in 79 or in Toronto, in Quebec, or Ontario in 80. Whatever. It broke out in select cities in the United States in a select time frame which corresponds exactly to the hepatitis B study. Len, okay, let's talk about that study for a minute. If you could conceive of a way that a vaccine could have been contaminated, how could it have happened? Robert, two ways. One way accidentally and one way intentionally. Len, all right, then elaborate. Robert, well, the vaccine was prepared from gays first off, and then it had plasma expanders that came from cattle added to it. Len, so hepatitis B vaccine is produced through the bovine serum? Robert, yes. It has expanders put into it as a mechanism of production. I want to buy that book. Robert, like serum? Or Len, like serum? Robert, yeah, serum. Because they needed to expand the volume. Len, now is the vaccine produced in cow carcasses? Robert, no, it's made from humans. Len, the hepatitis B vaccine is made from the gay men's serum? Robert, and also from straight men's serum. Len, okay. Robert, and that's the most interesting thing. Why did they make two separate vaccines? Len, yeah, why? Robert, because the epitopes, surface molecules of hepatitis B antigens, in gays was different than in straights. So what does that tell you? Len, I'm not quite sure. Robert, well, it tells you that there's a lot of exchange going on between the two pools. Because if there were, the hepatitis B would not have separated in two epitopes. So if there was a lot of exchange, the information would have been heterogeneous in the pools, not homogeneous and not different between homosexual and heterosexual men. Now suppose you introduce a virus which is transferred like hepatitis B into the gay pool or population. When it shows up in the homosexual pool? When will it show up in the heterosexual pool? Len, I don't know when. Robert, well, it will take a long time to show up there because what you know is that the exchange of information going on between homosexuals and heterosexuals is limited. So Simian was the guy who conducted that study. Simian came from Poland and was educated in Moscow. He somehow managed to escape from Poland to the United States with his family in tow and ended up in New York City as the head of the New York City Blood Bank. That is interesting. I thought, as I reflected on my recent tour of the National Holocaust Museum in Washington, the Nazis, I learned, had done extensive blood and genetics research in an effort to discriminate and exterminate mixed breeds from their racist and white supremacist world. A Russian-educated Polish researcher with Zimuznis's credentials could have best survived Nazi-occupied Poland by joining the Nazis' research effort, or post-Nazi Poland by serving Russia. How did he end up in the United States? I wondered if there was a link between the Nazi effort to exterminate homosexuals and Zimuznis's study that targeted gays with allegedly tainted hepatitis B vaccines. The German-owned Merck company, after all, funded the study and produced the experimental and control vaccines. Len, still somewhat perplexed, I asked. That's the theory of unintentional infection? Robert, well, the fact is that the vaccine could have been prepared in a way that unintentionally infected them. Yes, but it might have been intentionally contaminated by somebody also. They may have been testing gays trying to develop an immunity against something and they knew was already ripping through Africa. It could be that they were testing it just to test it, or it could be that somebody intentionally was trying to exterminate gays, or, in our opinion, it could be that their actual goal was to exterminate the United States. Strecker's latter remark took me by surprise. It was the first thing he said which made no sense. Len, the actual goal was to try to exterminate the United States? And that's one of your most plausible explanations? Robert, yes. Len, and who would have been behind that? Robert, some foreign party, the Russians or someone who didn't like us, because the Russians have talked about it for 50 years. There have been KGB biological warfare experts that have been trying to do that to us for 50 years. I felt intuitively uncomfortable with Strecker's explanation. I recalled his comments about Walter Nelson Rees, which proved the Soviets knew far less about viral biotechnology than American researchers. Moreover, it seemed far-fetched to believe that Russians had somehow managed to infiltrate the New York City Blood Center, which appeared to be the starting point of the AIDS epidemic in America. This part of Strecker's theory would have required Zimuznis or one of his associates to have been a secret agent working in Russia. Or, in my opinion, it was all those Project Paperclip Nazis brought over into our own country and Antarctica. Okay, but why would they have started with the gays? Robert, for a very obvious reason. That is because nothing would be done. Just think about it. Suppose you put this virus in heterosexuals or kids. What kind of response would have occurred compared to the response that did occur? Len, right, that's for sure. Quite different. I appreciate that. But still, even to this day, the heterosexual spread is limited compared to the spread in the gay population. Robert, only in this country. Len, right. Robert, if you look in the world, what percentage of the world's AIDS cases are heterosexuals? Len, 90%. Robert, over 90%. Right, exactly. It's only in this country that you have this strange, unexplained predominance of homosexuals. Now that's why you have to remember what I just told you. What happens when you put a virus that is transferred like hepatitis B into the homosexuals? When does it appear in heterosexuals? Len, not for a long time. Robert, exactly. That's why I think it was pure genius. Now people say, well, nobody would think of that. And my answer to that is, well, I thought of it, so why couldn't they think of it? Len, I still like my theory better. Problems with the communist theory flooded my head. Strecker noted the Russians were way behind us in viral research. How would the Russians have gained access to the viruses in Gallows or Merck's labs in the first place? Well, possibly by paperclip, but we got most of the Nazis. They got some of them, but we got more. Even if Simian had been a Russian agent, he would have needed to gain access to the viruses first in order to contaminate the vaccines. Also, had the Russians created AIDS-like viruses shortly after Gallo surely did, then why had Gallo become the world's preeminent retrovirologist and not some Russian? Also, the patents are worth millions. Why would the United States and not Russia hold the patents on the AIDS virus antibodies and cell lines? Robert, yeah, I don't have that answer. I'm just telling you my theory. After vaccine trials. Len, okay, so that's the intentional theory. Len, okay, so that's the intentional theory. Robert, yeah. It could have been an experiment. It could have been intentional to get rid of gays. It could have been intentional to infect us all. Len, okay, Robert. And you see what happened. In our opinion, IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, took these viruses to Africa in the early 1970s and tested them because we think they were trying to get the virus cancer hypothesis proved. They wanted to develop a vaccine, and they wanted to find out which of those viruses were actually causing cancer because they weren't sure. So how do you prove it? How do you prove Koch's postulates? K-O-C-H. I'm calling you Koch. Koch's postulates in the case of virus and cancer. Len, difficult. Robert, yeah, you've got to test them. Len, right. Robert, it's like saying because you have lung cancer in women, it's because they wear the hose. It's because they wear hose. That doesn't prove anything. You've got to have causation, so they were stuck. Now that's what was said in our reference, they said. Let's test it. Let's test it in humans with the same degree of sophisticated experiments that we use in animals. What does that mean? And then they published their test sites. And the test sites are exactly where AIDS is. We had these huge laboratories over here, Len. And what year was that? Robert, 1972, I think. It says that epidemiological studies are of no use per se, so what do you conclude? Len, that they're going to have to test it in a population. Robert, exactly. And then it says we're going to test these things in SIB ships, brothers and sisters from the same family. And they were going to study the time course of the infection. And then we said, what do you mean by that? And they said, well, we're going to study the antibody response. And I said, well, you already knew the antibody response. How could there be any course to that? The only thing that a time course could refer to is an infection, which means you had to have active particles. That's all in reference. Anyway, in 1972, they said, let's make a T-cell destroyer. That's out of the bulletin of the WHO. Len, that I know. Robert, the same year they said, let's test it, and then let's inject it. And then they published their test sites, which is a map of Africa where they have all their test sites, and that corresponds exactly to the outbreak of AIDS. Len, how do you have Do you have those maps anywhere, Robert? They're in the references we published. They're also in the Federal Register. So we think that they went over there and tested it. Then somebody put it back into us or simply used it in us. Again, I thought, it makes more sense to place the source of the experimental AIDS virus in Bethesda and not Russia, given that the WHO had made the National Cancer Institute, and not the Russian institution, the initial distributor of viral testing reagents. And since the initial homosexual outbreak of AIDS was in New York, Simian and his New York colleagues, along with Merck researchers, seemed to be the prime suspects. Then I wondered whether there were any documented links between Gallo's group and Simian. Manufacturing AIDS-like viruses. Oh my goodness, this goes on for a while. Len, okay, now let's get a little bit more specific about the virus itself. With regard to the AIDS virus, had it been specifically manufactured, what might have been the first steps? What do you think the researchers began with? Robert, I think they began with bovine visnovirus, which they knew was a T-cell destroyer, and they made that by crossing bovine visnoviruses in cattle. Visna is the virus in sheep. Its characteristic is a destroyer, and they wanted a T-cell destroyer. So they took a T-cell attacker, the bovine leukemia virus, and crossed it with a Visna virus to make a T-cell destroyer, which is exactly what they got. But then all they had was a T-cell destroyer in cattle, which wasn't very good for humans. So then they grew it in human tissue, and when you do that, it adapts to human beings. See figure 7.1. Let's just go to 7.1. Still reading. Where am I? 7.1. And there are a host of ways to get these things back to... And there are a host of ways to get these things to grow in tissue, even if the receptors won't take the virus. And here is... I'll show you the... I guess you could read it if you want, but I'll read it. Starting with the... Theoretic manufacture of AIDS-like viruses for bovine leukemia and sheep viruses. Strecker theorized that bioweapons researchers began by mixing bovine leukemia viruses, which they knew were T-cell attackers, with sheep Visna viruses, which were recognized T-cell destroyers. They thus produced bovine Visna virus. Next, in order to get these viruses to cross the species barrier and infect human cells, Strecker reported that researchers may have cultured them with herpes viruses or human white blood cells. The viruses were thus repackaged. Herpes virus envelopes, for instance, then contained genes for bovine Visna virus, which could have easily created a virus that did everything the AIDS virus did. HIV-like virus, AIDS, question mark. And after just another look at it. Back to the other page. Len, they could have delivered the viral RNA a number of ways. Robert, yes, one of the ways is by pseudovirus formations. Pseudovirus formations is where you put in a simultaneous mixture of cells and viruses, and what happens is, for instance, if you put bovine Visna virus in with herpes virus, in the packaging process, you'll get bovine Visna virus genome inside a herpes coat, and Visna virus, vice versa. If you put bovine and Visna viruses in with herpes virus in the packaging process, you'll get the bovine Visna virus genome inside a herpes cell coat and vice versa. So then you separate out all herpes ones, and it just infects any cells which are sensitive to herpes, and you can artificially introduce bovine Visna virus into a herpes sensitive cell because it has BVV on the inside and herpes on the outside. Len, I remember reading through studies about that technique being used. Robert, yeah, another way is you treat them with heat and they open up. Or you use some detergents that will open them up. Or there's a host of different things. Even some viruses will tend to open them up. It makes the cells permeable even though they normally wouldn't be. So you can introduce the one you want to get in even though there's no real receptor for it. Len, okay, so it could have been bovine Visna virus, but also there was some speculation it could have been scrapie, another sheep virus, right? Robert, yeah, well, scrapie's a little bit different than Visna, but basically I don't think scrapie's a retrovirus. It's like it, but it's not the culprit. Len, during our first conversation, you also mentioned, like other researchers, you could actually take a look at the AIDS virus. And it looks like it's been spliced in particular regions. Robert, oh yes, actually looking at it was one of the first things that told us what it was, bovine Visna virus and AIDS. Of course, look identical, and there weren't that many D-type retroviruses. There were only a few. The D-type are cylindrical-shaped retroviruses, which of course BVV and AIDS are identical, besides the fact that they were both magnesium dependent and were T-cell attackers. That would produce syncytium. The T-cells attackers would produce syncytium and would wipe out cells, and then what you do is look at the genome, actually a paper by Gallo published in Science. I think about 83 or 86, said he took the restriction endonucleases, scissor-like enzymes, and treated the virus and showed that when the virus falls apart, that where it falls apart exactly at the gene lines. In other words, it manages to fall apart just as the places In other words, it manages to fall apart just at the places where they could have constructed it. Len, is that right? Just where the foreign pieces might have come together? Robert, yes, it falls apart in 10 or 12 places. Because those endonucleases cut at specific points. But what's interesting is, if it occurred spontaneously in nature, why would it fall apart exactly where the genes occurred? The gag, pole, envelope, the tat genes, everything sort of cuts apart, just the way you would put it together if you were constructing it. This, we thought, was the strongest piece of evidence that would have said they actually put it together entirely in a lab. Len, and how might they have done that then? Let's say they started with BVV. Robert, well, in this case, if you start with BVV, you just manipulate it to grow in human tissue to adapt it to humans. If you started with BLV and Visna, you would take the viruses, cut them up with enzymes, then chromatograph them so that they're homologous. That is, the 10 different parts separate. Then you take each different part that you want uniquely and put it together with other parts and zip them up. Len, and how do they zip them up or combine them? Robert, they have enzymes that sew them back up just like they've got ones which cut them apart. These are repair enzymes. Len, then they separate those particular viruses and they put them into cells? Robert, they put them into serum, add your enzymes and other parts and wait for a while, and then throw everything into a culture and see what happens. I was still a bit fuzzy. Robert, but you see, that's work. You don't have to do that. Nature does it all for you. All you do is take a cow and simultaneously inject bovine in one hip and Visna in the other, and the cow is your mixer. And it will do it for you automatically, because what happens is the virus is so unstable that they will recombine and produce every thermodynamically stable recombinant possible. I'm reading that over. And it will do it for you automatically, because what happens is the viruses are so unstable that they will recombine and produce every thermodynamically stable recombinant possible. Len, interesting. It's unbelievable. Robert, yeah, you see, that's why everybody says, we didn't make the viruses. We didn't have the techniques. That's nonsense. Robert, right, that's bull too, but of course our answer is, well, the virus makes itself, so you don't even have to implicate them for genetic engineering viewpoint if you don't want to. Strecker, then provide a unique common sense metaphor for the emergence of HIV. Robert, it's like saying you've got a baby with no arms and legs and somebody dressed it up to look It's like saying you got a baby with no arms and legs and somebody dressed it up and took it to a party in Beverly Hills. Well, it sure couldn't do that and get there by itself. Evidence against simians. Len, what about the simian monkey viruses? Why do they have scientists throughout the world claiming HIV is a simian monkey type virus? Robert, because they get money for that, you know. Here, send more money. Let me tell you about the simian AIDS virus. First off, how does simian AIDS virus work? It produces a protein that causes AIDS in simians, and it's very easy to make a vaccine against a protein, and that's actually a derivative of the Mason-Pfizer monkey virus, which is another laboratory creation. Another man-made virus in the lab, which was a simian virus that was being used for various things. It will cause AIDS in apes, but it doesn't do it like HIV. It does it by making a protein that wipes out their immune system. Len, is it also a specific T-cell destroyer? Robert, no. The virus produces a protein, and the protein messes up the immune system, and it's very easy to make a vaccine against a protein. But AIDS works entirely different. It wipes out the T cells and works inside macrophages. It inhibits the processing plant. AIDS is really a problem of macrophages, not of lymphocytes. The virus makes the macrophage dysfunction. I think that's the folding and unfolding of cells or proteins. I don't know. I'm trying to understand it too. Len, okay, so what happens then? Robert, they run around the body and inject it into other cells. That's how the virus gets into other cells. That's how the virus gets into cells that don't have receptors for it. Len, so the macrophages actually reproduce the virus, then distribute it? Okay, so they're reproducing the virus, so they're folding in a specific type of way. Yes. Robert, yes, that's exactly what happens. That's how it gets into the brain. It's carried across the blood-brain barrier by macrophages that then inject it into the brain cells. Len, because T4 lymphocytes don't cross the barrier? Robert, yeah, they do, but they don't inject it. They don't have sex with cells, whereas the macrophages do. And also, the viruses are bigger than the pores of the membranes, so they can't get across directly. Something has to carry it. Strecker's colleagues. Len, now let's discuss some of your colleagues. Others have reported similar findings to yours. During our first conversations, we talked briefly about John Steele. What do you know about his work? Robert Steele started writing about AIDS in 81 or so, even before us, and he was the first guy to say AIDS was not a venereal disease, and that it appeared to be artificial and spreading in an unusual manner, which was really just looking at the fact that the virus appeared in different areas of the world at the same time. Robert, by the way, do you know the story of Parvo 2? Len, no. Robert, Parvo 2 virus is a dog virus that appeared simultaneously around the world at the same time and proceeded to kill hundreds of millions of dogs. How does a virus appear in Australia, Europe, and Asia all at the same time? Len, American Airlines? Robert, right, American Airlines. We both laughed. Robert, okay, and then instead of spending contagiously from one dog to another. Oh, I think that's a fancy word for contagious. Okay, then instead of spreading continuously from one dog to the other, the viruses were spreading and popped up in different areas around the world, as if directed mutations had occurred and had delivered by humans. And Parvo 2 was eventually proven by genetic techniques to be feline panleukopenic virus, which had contaminated dog vaccines. So Steele was observing the same thing with AIDS. How was the virus appearing at different spots in the world at the same time, in a sense, without any contagious spread? I'm contagious spread. Contiguous. It's a contagious spread. I mean, even if you look at the gay transmission theory, if AIDS started in Africa, Haiti, Paris, and then New York, why wasn't there AIDS in Miami or New Orleans or Dallas? I mean, those guys were going to Haiti, New York, and Africa and Paris far more than the gays from San Francisco. I mean, none of this theory makes any sense. Then Steele began to write the same thing. Len, Jacob Segal, from Humboldt University in Berlin? Robert, yes, he was at the Institute of Biology in East Berlin. He was writing the same stuff, but again, he thought that the virus was constructed from human T lymphocyte virus 1 and Visna. And that's correct, except he didn't go far enough because really HTLV1 is just bovine leukemia virus in man. So both Steele and Segal were saying the same sort of stuff, but neither one could exactly figure out how it was done. And so that's basically what we figured out how it occurred, and we believe it occurred at Fort Detrick. And Segal was probably supplied information by the KGB. This sudden reference to the KGB threw me again. Somehow, I needed to reconcile why Strecker, who believed the Russians may have brought AIDS to America, also recognized Fort Detrick as the source of the scourge. Robert, the Russians wrote in over 400 public places that the virus was constructed over here. And if you remember, our good Surgeon General went over there and made a deal with them. I don't know if you know anything about that. Len, what Surgeon General was that? I don't know why he put general. Must be some type of... Was he a fag? I don't know. I'm not sure. Len, which Surgeon General was that? Robert, Knoop. Len, no, I didn't know that. Robert, yeah, Knoop went to Russia, to Moscow, and basically made a deal with them to stop talking about it, and we'd give them our money. That doesn't surprise me, I thought, reflecting on the alleged apology Gorbachev offered Reagan according to Covert's Cutting Edge. Len, that's what I figured caused something like that. Wait. That's what I figured caused something like that is talked about vaguely in the book that I got from Fort Detrick. By the way, have you seen that book? Robert, no. Len, you've got to get a copy of it. It came out in 1993. It's the 50-year history of Fort Detrick. It's free. They'll send it to you. Robert, well, they won't send me one. Strecker seemed to relish that possibility and his notoriety. Len, oh, they will. It's by a very nice guy. He's the public relations director for the fort. His name is Norman Covert. Imagine that. Norman Covert? Strecker laughed heartily. Is that a code name? Len, that's his real name. It's perfect, huh? Robert, well, do you know anything about what's going on there? The Anthrax building? Len, yes, I read about that. Robert, do you know about the Ebola building? Len, vaguely. Robert, well, they've got another building that's contaminated now that they can't get into because of Ebola. You know they've got a whole bunch of problems. There's a bunch of people in Frederick, Maryland that believe everything we talk about. We've quite a few supporters there because they've had a lot of problems with strange illnesses, so they're not entirely unsuspicious. I shuddered for a moment, considering the fact that I was scheduled to visit Frederick on my way to present an AIDS education seminar in western Pennsylvania later in the year. Len, Robert, here's another tip. Dr. Manuel Servin of the National Autonomous University of Mexico said that research conducted at Columbia University by the U.S. Army was starting to point to the deadly disease in Haiti. He said that an unexplained accident caused the virus to spread to an employee of Haitian origin, and this person, he believed, brought it back to Haiti. What do you think of that theory? Robert, no, there were like 47,000 Haitians working in Zaire at the time of these experiments, so we think they either got it from the vaccine project or from the gays that were infected. Len, okay, so there were tens of thousands of Haitians working on health and welfare activities in Zaire during the 1970s? Robert, yes. Len, okay, so here's another one. There was a European physician who told Russian journalists that he believed he was working for Department of Defense subcontractor with orders to mutate simian monkey viruses to produce fast-killing human viruses. Have you heard of that? Robert, no, but that's entirely possible. Len, and this report went on to say that the experiment was considered a partial failure because they got a slow-acting virus than a fast one. They were allegedly looking for fast-acting killers. Robert, except that quick viruses are, of course, worthless because they're too easy to defend against. I mean, a very fast-acting virus is not good. Len, what do you mean? Robert, Frank Fenner talks about all the characteristics. It's out of Cold Springs Harbor. That's the other great biowarfare place. It's the Eugenics Institute. Cold Springs is in upstate New York. That was the place started by Margaret Sanger. I didn't know it was Margaret Sanger. And others. Now they're, of course, the biggest biological warfare place under the guise of just research. Anyway, Cold Springs Harbor put out a big thing on MMMV that is the maximally monstrous malignant virus, and that they gave all the characteristics. and they talked about what it would take to produce this kind of virus. And of course, all the characteristics are exactly those of the AIDS virus except for one thing, and that is aerosolized transmission, which we believe is potentially possible. Oh, God forbid, I thought. I hadn't heard that theory before. Given Strecker's obvious intelligence and formidable knowledge, his assertion startled me. Robert, but they produced papers about what makes viruses malignant and monstrous. And one of the things is that they work slowly and not fast, and that they are constantly mutating, exactly the characteristics of AIDS. Len, interesting. It's unbelievable. Robert, yes it is. Final recommendations. Len, now the first time we spoke, you mentioned something about forthcoming... Okay. Now the first time we spoke, you mentioned something about a forthcoming cure for AIDS. How might it work? Robert, well, it's very simple in theory, complicated in practice. Basically, just as the viruses are little crystals, you might hit them with electromagnetic frequencies and destroy them, just as you can shake down a crystal and destroy it without disrupting the surrounding house. You can theoretically disrupt viruses without destroying the surrounding cell structure. Len, are there laboratories working on that? Robert, not that I know of. Why, that doesn't make any money. Why would they do that? Len, okay, now there was something in the news the other day that the French had allegedly discovered a cure. Have you heard anything new? Robert, nah, I haven't heard or seen anything. I can't believe the word would not be all over everywhere if they thought they had a cure, particularly the French. Now you see also what is Pasteur. The Pasteur Institute is their biowarfare institute, the same as Portendown in England, the same as Ivanskovsky Institute in Russia, the same as the Tokyo Institute. These are all biowarfare centers for these countries. They're also the great AIDS research centers for these countries. Len, right, it figures. Now my last question. If you could tell people one thing about AIDS or your theories, what would it be? Robert, the whole story, everything, how the virus was made, that it was man-made, and we think it represents a threat to the human species. Len, and if there's some positive thing that people can do, and if there's some positive thing that people can do you might recommend what it would be? Robert, other than no IV drugs, reduce their sexual promiscuity, and no blood products, start by questioning some of the things that they hear, which may or may not be true. Ooh, long chapter today. That's it. We'll begin chapter 8, HIV 1, 2, or the Big Bang tomorrow.